He shielded an alien child from poisoned arrows. 30 years later, an empress knelt before him. The warship came down without a sound. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Every ship I had ever seen land made noise, engines screaming, thrusters clawing at the air, the great mechanical groan of something too heavy for the sky finally giving in to gravity. But this one descended through the morning clouds above Rhea 9 like it was being lowered on silk thread. No sound, no warning. Just a shadow that swallowed half my garden and kept growing. I was 67 years old and crouched between rows of tomato plants when it happened. My back hurt the way it always did before noon. My left knee had been making a sound like gravel in a tin can ever since a poorly judged hike 3 winters ago. I had coffee going on the porch and absolutely no intention of doing anything more dramatic with my Tuesday than harvesting the early reds and maybe watching the sunset from my chair. The warship was the size of a city block, iridescent hull, Veilthari design. I recognized it immediately because I had spent 2 years in a place where Veilthari ships were either your protection or your death, and your body learns to tell the difference fast. This one bore the gold and violet markings of the Imperial Compact. Not a war vessel, a ceremonial ship, the kind they brought to coronations and state funerals. It settled half a kilometer from my fence line, and the landing ramp opened like a jaw. They came out in columns, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Veilthari soldiers in full ceremonial armor, the kind made from polished chitin plate that catches light and throws it back in colors that don't exist in any human language. They formed ranks in the red dust of my colony planet, with the precision of people who had practiced this exact formation for a very long time. The sound of their feet on the soil was like distant rain. And then she appeared at the top of the ramp. 7 feet tall, the way all high-caste Veilthari run. 4 arms folded in the gesture that means something between reverence and readiness. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along the edges of her face and throat. Amber going to gold, which in their emotional vocabulary meant something I couldn't quite translate, but had the flavor of overwhelming feeling held very tightly in check. Her armor was white and violet, and carried the seal of the Empress of the Veilthari Compact, which I had seen exactly once before, on a broadcast, when she was crowned 6 years ago, and 70 billion beings watched. She walked toward me alone. No guard flanked her, no aide preceded her. Just the Empress, crossing my patch of red Rhea 9 dirt, stepping around a low fence post with careful grace, and stopping 3 feet from where I was still crouching between my tomato plants with soil on my gloves and coffee cooling on my porch. She looked at me with those amber eyes. They were glowing, bright, the way they only glow when something enormous is moving through a Veilthari that they cannot quite contain. And then she knelt. The Empress of 70 billion souls put one knee in the dirt of my garden and lowered her head. Behind her, every soldier in those perfect columns did the same, thousands of them, kneeling in the dust of my frontier colony, and the silence was so total I could hear my own heartbeat. I said the only thing I could think of. "Kid, you didn't have to come all this way." Her head came up. Those eyes found mine, and for just a second, just the barest edge of a second, something flickered across her face that was not imperial at all. It was something much younger. Something I recognized from 30 years ago, from a ruined outpost on a jungle moon, from a small, terrified creature that had bitten straight through my patrol glove and then refused to let go. She said my name, Marcus Vale. She said it in perfect English, unaccented, the kind of pronunciation that takes years of deliberate practice. Then she said it again in High Veilthari, which gave it 3 more syllables and a resonance that made the word feel like it meant something sacred. Then she said, "You shielded me with your body when I was no one. I have spent 30 years becoming someone worthy of returning to tell you that it mattered." I sat back on my heels in the dirt, and I let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting inside me for 3 decades. Let me tell you about Dascar IV. It was a jungle moon, hot and wet, and absolutely miserable in every direction. The kind of place where your gear rusted if you looked at it wrong, and the insects treated your neck as a dining location of particular interest. We were posted there as a UN Frontier Patrol Unit, 12 of us, under a mandate that said neutrality, in bold letters at the top of every page. The Veilthari Civil War had been burning for 60 years before we arrived, and the standing orders were simple: observe, document, Do not engage. Stay out of it. This is not our war. I was 37, a sergeant with 11 years of service, and enough scar tissue to write a short novel about questionable decisions. My unit was good, Corporal Ned Harlow, who could fix anything with 2 hands and bad language. Private Claire Denton, sharpest eyes in the patrol, the kind of soldier who never missed anything. Specialist Owen Grady, our medic, who complained constantly and saved lives constantly, and somehow managed to do both simultaneously. We had been on Dascar for 4 months, when the Loyalist column retreated through our position. We heard the battle first, that distant crump and roar that travel ahead of violence like a calling card. Then we saw the smoke rolling through the jungle canopy, green and black, and Harlow looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both knew that staying neutral was about to require a level of active effort that the people who wrote our orders had probably not fully thought through. The Loyalist column was pulling back hard. Velthari soldiers moving fast through the undergrowth, carrying their wounded, falling back in the organized chaos that happens when a retreat is still just barely controlled. They swept past our position like a river going around a rock, and we pressed flat against the outpost walls and stayed very, very still. That's when I saw the wall come down. On the far side of the courtyard, a section of the old structure, pre-war construction, stone and composite, already cracked in 100 places, gave up under the pressure of nearby detonations and collapsed. Not catastrophically, just one section, maybe 3 meters of wall, folding down into rubble. And from inside that rubble, something moved. Small, too small. A shape that didn't belong to any soldier or fighter or adult anything. Claire saw it the same time I did. She grabbed my arm. Our eyes met. I looked at the rubble. I looked at the retreating column. I looked at the jungle line beyond the courtyard, where the rebel skirmishers would come through in maybe 4 minutes, maybe less. I said, "Stay here. Cover me." She said several things in response that I will not repeat, but which expressed deep concern for my judgment. I went anyway. The child was wedged under the heaviest piece of the fallen wall, one arm pinned, amber eyes wide open, and absolutely electric with panic. 4 years old by Velthari reckoning, maybe equivalent to a human 2-year-old in terms of what they understand about the world and how much of it makes sense. What she understood right then was rubble, and noise, and the smell of burning, and the absence of everyone she knew. I dug her out with my hands. The rubble was heavy, and I moved it wrong, and my lower back registered a formal complaint that it is still filing to this day. She came free in a surge of dust, and the first thing she did was sink her teeth into my left hand with everything she had, through the glove, through the skin, and the pain was sharp enough to make my vision go white at the edges. I did not let go. I wrapped my patrol jacket around her. She was shaking so hard I could feel it through 3 layers of fabric, and I tucked her against my chest the way you'd carry something you had decided mattered more than your own comfort, and I straightened up and turned back toward the outpost. The first arrow came out of the jungle line and skipped off the courtyard floor 2 feet to my left. The rebel skirmishers were not using standard weapons. Dense jungle environments eat standard weapons. They jam, they hang up on undergrowth. The targeting systems lose their minds in the canopy interference. The rebels on Dascar IV had gone the other direction entirely and reverted to bows. Compound recurves, precision-made, with arrows tipped in a paralytic toxin brewed from 3 local plants that worked beautifully on Velthari physiology. The second arrow came close enough that I felt the wind of it against my right ear. I had maybe 2 seconds to think, and I spent both of them on the same calculation. If I ran for the outpost, I would be crossing 30 meters of open courtyard, and she was in my arms, and the arrows were coming, and there was no version of that math where she stayed unhurt. So I stopped. I turned my back to the jungle line. I curved myself around her completely, head down, shoulders up, spine presented outward, and I held on and I took it. 4 arrows, 1 in the left shoulder, 1 across the back of my right arm, 2 in a cluster at the mid-back, which I learned later had cracked a rib and bruised a kidney and missed the spine by a distance that my medic Owen described, while white-faced, as disgustingly close. The toxin hit my bloodstream within seconds. Owen would later explain that the paralytic was calibrated for Velthari neurochemistry. which meant that in a human it worked differently. Not fully, not cleanly, not with the elegant efficiency it achieved in its intended targets. Instead, it did something that he described in medical terms, and I will describe in plain ones. It felt like every nerve in my body simultaneously decided to scream at top volume, while simultaneously losing interest in doing their actual jobs. My legs went first, then my hands. I went down on my knees without intending to, still holding her, and Claire was already crossing the courtyard at a dead sprint, and Harlow was right behind her with his weapon up, and Grady was somewhere behind both of them already opening his kit. And the last clear thing I remember before the toxin took my vision was the feeling of her small hands locked around my collar. She had not let go either. I spent 3 weeks in the field hospital sweating out the paralytic. Owen described the process of extracting 4 arrows as the most unpleasant afternoon of my career, which, coming from a man who had served on 4 different conflict postings, was some kind of record. My rib healed, my kidney bruised and unbruised, my shoulder took longer and has never been fully right since, which is why I roll it a certain way when the weather changes, and Harlow, when he visits, still calls it my weather station. On the 4th day, a loyalist Veilthari commander came to the hospital, senior rank. I could tell by the coloring on his armor and the way the nurses stepped back when he entered. He stood by my cot and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in his language, something that the interpreter translated as, "The child has been recovered. She is unharmed." He gave me the formal nod, the one that means the absolute highest acknowledgement a Veilthari offers someone who is not one of them. One short, precise inclination of the head that encodes, according to everything I had ever read about their culture, something along the lines of, "I recognize that you exist, and that what you did has weight." Then he left. I never learned her name, the child. Nobody told me, and I never asked. Partly because asking would have required navigating 3 levels of Veilthari formal protocol while still on painkillers, and partly because it seemed like the kind of detail that wasn't mine to know. I knew she was alive. I knew she was safe. That felt like enough. The scar on my left palm, where her teeth had gone through the glove, healed into a small crescent. I called it the handshake. It seemed like the right word for it. The first contact between 2 people who had no shared language and absolutely no reason to trust each other, pressed into skin by pure instinct. I got a commendation. I got a medical discharge 18 months later, when it became clear that my shoulder was not going to cooperate with the physical requirements of continued frontier patrol duty. I came to Rhea 9 because the land was cheap and the sky was red at sunset in a way that reminded me of Dascar IV without the incoming fire. I grew tomatoes. I grew old. I watched 30 years move through the window of a frontier house, and I thought about a lot of things, but I did not think about that particular jungle moon very often. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered in a way that didn't need to be thought about. It was just there, like the scar, like the shoulder, like the way I still flinch when something moves fast in my peripheral vision. HFY. That was her name. She told it to me herself, standing in my garden, still kneeling, still glowing with those eyes. 3rd daughter of the loyalist ruling caste. Low in the succession at the time of Dascar IV. Low enough that nobody thought to protect her properly during the retreat. Low enough that her separation from the column had been, according to how she described it, noticed only after the immediate crisis was over. Low enough that the commander who came to my hospital cot did not even tell me who she was. She grew up. The war ended, badly for everyone, the way civil wars tend to. The first daughter died in a siege. The second daughter was killed in the succession violence that followed the peace. HFY. 3rd daughter, too young during the war to have made enemies, old enough by the time of the succession to be underestimated by everyone who might have wanted to make her one, survived. More than survived. She told me what the next 30 years had looked like from the inside. Quiet diplomacy between factions that hated each other. Alliances built on patience. 3 separate moments where she was close enough to the end of everything that the people around her started making contingency plans, and she pulled back from each of them by doing the thing that nobody in Veilthari imperial politics had done in living memory. She admitted fault, changed course, and let other people be right in public. It broke precedent so badly that the first time she did it, Her advisors thought she had suffered some kind of cognitive event. The second time, they started to understand that she was doing it on purpose. The third time, the faction that had been her most committed enemy sent a private envoy to ask if she would be willing to meet. She unified 3 factions over 2 decades. She ended the civil war that had been burning since before she was born. When she was crowned Empress of the Velthari Compact 6 years ago, the ceremony was broadcast to 70 billion Velthari across 4 star systems, and every news service in human space covered it, because the implications for interstellar relations were significant enough that even people who couldn't have found Velthari space on a map paid attention. The first thing she announced after the crown was placed was that she was personally traveling to find a human named Marcus Vale. Her advisors had opinions about this. Strong opinions, expressed forcefully and at length, covering the diplomatic complications, the security implications, the political optics of an empress making a personal pilgrimage to a human frontier colony for reasons they could not explain to the public, in language that would make sense to 70 billion people who had spent 60 years in a civil war and were still raw from it. She listened to all of them. Then she said, "There is a debt. It will be paid. The compact does not leave debts unpaid, and neither do I." It took her 6 years to clear her schedule long enough to make the journey. 6 years of running an empire while also, apparently, learning to speak English without an accent, so that when she arrived, she could say what she needed to say in the language of the man she was coming to find. "I know what my advisors told me," she said, still kneeling, still holding my eyes. "I know what it cost in political terms to make this journey. I know that 70 billion people are watching this transmission, and most of them do not yet understand what they are seeing." She paused. The amber in her eyes went to something deeper, that true gold that I had not seen in any Velthari since Dascar IV, the color that means something so large there is no word for it. "I came anyway," she said, "because you did not calculate the cost before you came to me. You did not weigh the politics or the protocol, or what it would mean if things went wrong. You came because I was small, and you were there, and it was the only right thing." I looked at her for a long moment. My coffee was cold on the porch. My tomatoes were still on the vine, my knee hurt, and my shoulder was starting to speak up the way it does when the morning gets past a certain hour. "I didn't do it for any of that," I said. "Not for Earth, not for the mission, not for whatever it might mean down the line. I did it because you were scared, and I was standing right there." "Yes," she said quietly. "I know. That is precisely why I came." She rose from her knee. All those thousands of soldiers rose behind her, a sound like wind moving through the ranks. She stood in my garden, 7 feet of Empress, and she reached into the formal sash at her side and removed something small and held it out to me on one open palm. An arrowhead, old design, Velthari composite material, shaped for a recurve bow, the tip still darkened at the edge where the toxin had been applied 30 years ago. "My toxin, my arrow. The soldiers recovered them," she said. "The loyalist forces. They kept them in the royal archive. They were labeled." She paused. "The label reads, 'From the day we were saved by a stranger.'" I took it. It was lighter than I expected. I turned it in my fingers and looked at it the way you look at something that connects you across 30 years to a moment you have never quite let yourself think about directly, because it was too large and too permanent and too wound up with everything you are. I put it in my left palm, the scarred one, the handshake palm. It fit there like it knew the address. "The handshake," I said, and I didn't mean to say it out loud, but it came out anyway. Her eyes flared gold. "What does that mean?" "That's what I called the scar," I said, "where you bit me." Something crossed her face that I had not seen there before. Something cracked open behind those eyes and was immediately, carefully, almost successfully contained. Her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly steady, and only a very small amount of it was not. "I did not know you kept count of it." "I'm a sentimental man," I said. "Always have been." She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she gave me the nod. The formal one, the same one the commander had given me 30 years ago in the hospital, but this time it went deeper somehow, traveled further, meant everything that formal gesture had been designed to mean, plus everything it had never been designed to carry, and was carrying anyway. I gave her one back, best I could manage with a human neck. She seemed to accept it. She stayed for 3 days. Her security personnel did not love this decision. They established a perimeter around my house that I found excessive, and she found insufficient, and we compromised by ignoring each other on the subject. She slept in her ship. She ate her own rations. But in the mornings and the evenings, she came to the garden, and we sat on the porch, and we talked. She told me what it was like to grow up knowing that someone had chosen her before she had earned anything, before she was anyone, before there was a single reason in the world to put a human body between her and 4 incoming arrows, except that she was small and scared, and he was right there. She told me what that knowledge had done to her over 30 years, how it had shaped the way she thought about power and debt and the meaning of protection, how it had made her ask, every single time she stood at a decision point, what the right thing was before she asked what the profitable thing was. I told her what it was like to be half paralyzed in a jungle moon hospital with no idea who she was or what would come of any of it. I told her about the commendation, which I have in a box somewhere and have never framed. I told her about the discharge and the shoulder and the tomatoes and the sunsets. I told her about the handshake. She listened the way people listen when they have been waiting a very long time to hear something and they want to get every word exactly right in their memory. On the second day, she asked if she could try a tomato. I said yes, and she picked one from the vine, the way I showed her, and she held it in her upper right hand and looked at it for a moment, with an expression that I think was scientific curiosity, and then she took a careful bite and went very still. "It's nothing like what I expected," she said. "Nothing ever is," I said. She considered that. Then she took another bite. On the third morning, before her ship prepared to leave, she presented me with the formal declaration. An aide brought it on a sealed document carrier, and I opened it and then read it again, because the first time through, I assumed I was misunderstanding something. I was not misunderstanding anything. Honorary First Intercessor of the Vaelthari Compact. A title with no precedent in Vaelthari history, because it had never been given to a non-Vaelthari before. Formal diplomatic standing between Earth and the Compact. Not arranged through the UN Diplomatic Corps, who had been petitioning for exactly this kind of arrangement for 20 years, and had a building full of people whose entire career purpose was achieving it. Through me. Through one human with bad knees, and a scarred left palm, and a garden full of tomatoes on a frontier colony planet. I looked up from the document. She was watching me read it with those gold-lit eyes, and something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was the Vaelthari adjacent. A particular quality of stillness that means satisfaction, I had learned over 3 days, deep and settled and certain. "My advisors have questions," she said, "about the optics of handling first formal contact between Earth and the Compact, through a retired frontier patrol sergeant with a vegetable garden." "And what did you tell them?" I said. "I told them," she said, "that this is precisely how it should happen, that the first contact between our peoples should be built on the foundation of what already happened between us 30 years ago, that the treaty should begin where the relationship began, with a human who calculated nothing and protected anyway." I thought about that. "There's a condition," I said. Her eyes shifted. "Name it." "Let me finish my tomatoes first." The sound she made was extraordinary. I had been listening to Vaelthari voices for 30 years, on recordings and broadcasts and field communications, and I had never heard one make this particular sound. It was like wind chimes struck by something larger than wind. It rose and fell and rang in the morning air of Rhea 9, and every soldier in that distant perimeter turned their head toward it. It was, I realized, laughter. Real laughter. The kind that happens before the person doing it can decide whether to let it out. "That," she said, when it settled, "is the most human thing I have ever heard." "I've been working on it for 67 years, I said. She left that morning. The ship rose in silence the way it had landed, pulling up through the red morning clouds of Rhea 9 with that impossible lightness, taking its thousands of soldiers and its ceremonial rankings, and its empress, with the gold-glowing eyes, back up toward the stars, where empires live. I stood in my garden and watched it until it was gone. Then I picked up the arrowhead from where I had set it on the porch railing, and turned it in the fingers of my left hand, the scarred one, the handshake hand. Ned Harlow called me 4 days later. He had seen the broadcasts. His exact words, after a long silence in which I imagine he was processing several things simultaneously, were, "Mate, you grew tomatoes for 30 years, and an empress knelt in your garden, and all you did was offer her a condition about the tomatoes." "They were almost ready," I said. Another silence. "Marcus," he said, "I genuinely don't know whether you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, or the most impossible one. At our age," I said, "those might be the same thing." Claire Denton sent a message from whatever posting she was on. She never quite stopped serving, never quite found a reason to set it down. The message was short. It said, "I knew you were going after that kid. I knew it before you did. 20 points that I never collected because I'm an idiot. I'm collecting them now." Owen Grady, who had retired to a teaching position at a medical college, and who I talked to every few months about nothing in particular, called on the morning the formal treaty announcement was made and said absolutely nothing for a full minute, and then said, very quietly, "Those arrows almost killed you." "Almost," I agreed. "And she built an empire," he said. "She did. From the person she was," he said, "on the day you went and got her." I thought about that for a long time after he hung up. I thought about small things and large things, and the distance between them. I thought about a jungle moon, and a child too scared to do anything but bite and hold on. I thought about what it means to protect something, before you know what it will become, before it has become anything, just because it is there, and it is small, and it is afraid, and you are a person standing in the right place at the wrong moment, with enough left in you to make one good decision. I thought about 30 years of tomatoes and sunsets, and a scar on a palm shaped like a crescent moon. I thought about an empress kneeling in red dust, gold-lit and certain, saying, "You did not calculate the cost." She was right. I didn't. I have never been particularly good at calculating costs before a thing needs doing. It has gotten me into trouble more times than I can count, from a military career standpoint, and a medical standpoint, and a financial standpoint, and several other standpoints that Harlow enjoys listing whenever he wants to win an argument. But standing in my garden on Rhea 9, with an arrowhead in my scarred left hand, and the red sun going down in the west, I could not find anything in the ledger to regret. I never went looking for history. I just couldn't walk past a scared kid in a war zone. Funny thing is, neither could she.